Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a topic that's been making waves, especially since the 2025 federal election, Alberta separatism.
It certainly grabbed headlines recently, yeah.
Yeah.
But looking through the sources you've shared, articles, research, polls, even online discussion, it's clear this isn't exactly a new idea popping up out of nowhere in Alberta.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And our mission with this deep dive is really to go through all that material, pull out the key bits, and try to understand the history, what's driving it, and, well, where this sentiment stands right now.
Right. Exploring the facts and the different perspectives in these sources, trying to get a clear picture of what's being discussed without sort of endorsing any specific viewpoint ourselves.
Absolutely. That impartiality is crucial here because, as the sources show, this is a really complex issue. Lots of different angles, strong feelings involved, both in Alberta and, across Canada.
For sure.
So let's unpack this. Why is this happening? What does it mean? And what are these sources telling us?
Okay, so at its heart, Alberta separatism is the idea of the province, well, leaving Canada. Simple enough on the surface?
Kind of, but the sources mention it's not always about a completely independent Alberta. Some ideas involve forming a union with other Western provinces or even joining the United States.
Interesting variations. And the sources you've given us point to some really deep-seated reasons behind this feeling, don't they?
You really do. A major one is this persistent sense of a power disparity compared to Ottawa, and maybe even compared to other parts of the West sometimes.
It goes way back.
Oh, yeah. The grievances stretch back over a century. Think about the idea of a larger province of Buffalo that, didn't happen back in 1905. Or Alberta becoming a province but not actually controlling its own natural resources until 1930. That history creates a narrative.
So it's not just about recent stuff. There's this historical memory almost of not having a fully equal footing or control.
Precisely. And the sources also highlight a strong sense of a distinct cultural and political identity in Alberta, a feeling that they're fundamentally different from central or Atlantic Canada.
And maybe even from other Western provinces at times. Sometimes, yeah. And then, time again, Canadian fiscal policy comes up. That's a huge one, particularly equalization payments and how they relate to Alberta's energy industry.
Right. Equalization.
That seems to be a constant flashpoint in the sources.
Definitely a significant lightning rod. The sources show Alberta has historically been a pretty consistent net over-contributor to the federal equalization program.
Let's trace those historical roots a bit more. Alberta became a province in 1905.
Right. And early on, there was that belief in a distinct identity, a different economy. Beyond just the equalization contribution, it's interesting that the sources cite historical trade patterns.
How so?
Well, they point out that a lot of Alberta's economic flow, historically, was actually north-south with the United States, especially Montana, not purely east-west within Canada.
Yeah. That north-south link adds an interesting layer to the identity piece, doesn't it?
It really does. It highlights those different economic connections and maybe cultural ties, too. Then, after World War II, you get the massive oil discoveries. Leduc #1, Redwater, huge wealth comes into the province. You'd think that would solve some problems.
Well, yes and no. Even with that prosperity, the sources show these grievances kind of lingered. Things like federal freight rates, protectionist policies.
Yeah.
Some felt these held Alberta back from really diversifying its economy beyond just resources.
Okay, so that brings us to a really critical period mentioned heavily in the sources, the 1970s and the National Energy Program, the NEP.
Absolutely pivotal, yeah. The 70s, you have to remember, were defined by global oil crises. The 1973 Yom Kippur War embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution,
Yeah.
massive price spikes globally.
And Albertans felt.
They felt they weren't getting the full international price for their oil, that it was being sold cheaper within Canada, effectively subsidizing the rest of the country.
And then, boom, 1980. The federal Liberal government under Pierre Trudeau introduces the NEP.
Right. Its stated goals were things like increasing Canadian ownership in the energy sector, making Canada energy self-sufficient. But a big part of it, certainly as seen in Alberta, was about redistributing the wealth generated by oil, more going to the federal government.
But the sources make it very clear that in Alberta, this was seen very, very differently.
Oh, absolutely. It was widely perceived as a direct attack, an intrusion on the province's jurisdiction over its resources, something that basically crippled the industry. The NEP included measures like a 25% tax on Alberta's oil revenue.
Wow, a direct tax on what they produced. What did the sources say the consequences were, like, on the ground?
They describe a devastating impact. A sharp drop in drilling activity. Major oil sands projects just canceled. High unemployment hitting the province hard.
And there was something else. The Petroleum Incentives Program.
Yeah, that was part of the NEP too. Critics felt it basically diverted investment capital away from Alberta, favoring exploration elsewhere in Canada.
So the feeling wasn't just that Alberta was paying a price, but that it was being, I don't know, sacrificed for the benefit of other parts of the country.
That was very much the perception among many in Alberta and the West, yeah. The sources show Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau became this deeply unpopular figure, vilified, really, during this time.
That's where those really visceral slogans came from, right? The ones mentioned in the sources. Like that infamous bumper sticker phrase, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark."
Yeah, that one definitely captures the raw anger. And there was another one. I'd rather push this thing a mile than buy gas from Petrocan. Petro-Canada being the national oil company created partly through the NEP.
Those really hit home. And the sources also mention the NEP hampered the growth of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund.
Significantly. That fund was specifically set up by the province to save resource revenues for the future, for diversification. The NEP really stunted its growth potential, which was seen as hindering those long-term goals.
And the NEP stayed in place until 1985, even when oil prices softened.
It did, even when the global oil glut in the 80s made Alberta's oil less economically attractive for Eastern Canada compared to cheaper foreign imports anyway.
Which, for many in Alberta, must have just added insult to injury.
Exactly. A policy seen as punishing the province stayed in place even after its supposed national benefits became, let's say, less clear.
This whole era seems to have directly kick-started some actual political movements in the 1980s, aiming to assert Western interests more forcefully.
It absolutely did. Separatist ideas really gained traction then. You had the Western Canada concept, the WCC holding rallies. Gordon Kessler was actually elected as an MLA in Alberta in 1982, running on the WCC platform.
A separatist MLA, wow. And there was another group, WestFed.
Yes, founded by Elmer Knutson. Now, Knutson himself might have tried to avoid the separatist label sometimes, but WestFed was widely seen as pushing for regional autonomy to a degree that, for many, basically amounted to separatism.
And he started another party, too.
Right, the Confederation of Regions Party, COR. They advocated for equal representation for 4 distinct Canadian regions. Their platform also included things like opposition to official bilingualism and metrication and wanting to abolish the Senate.
So a whole spectrum of ideas bubbling up, from outright separation to major reforms within Canada.
Exactly. Then you get Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives winning that huge majority in 1984. They subsequently dismantled the NEP.
And that took the wind out of the separatist sails.
For a while, yeah. The energy behind the movement really died down. There was a period of hope, maybe, for a better relationship with Ottawa under a government with strong Western representation.
But that hope didn't fully deliver for everyone, according to the sources.
Apparently not. Disappointment followed. You know, with many PC MPs still coming from central Canada, some Albertans felt their specific concerns still weren't the top priority. And then came a major flashpoint.
The CF-18 contract.
That's the one. The federal government awarded the big maintenance contract for the CF-18 fighter jets to Bombardier in Quebec. This was despite a Western company, Bristol Aerospace in Winnipeg, having what many people saw as a technically superior and cheaper bid.
And that decision is directly linked in the sources to the creation of the Reform Party.
It is a direct link. The Reform Party of Alberta, which quickly became the Reform Party of Canada, was founded in 1987, partly in direct response to that CF-18 decision.
Led by Preston Manning.
Right. And a key distinction here, it was a populist party, definitely from the right, but it was explicitly non-separatist.
The West wants in. That was their famous slogan.
Exactly. They aimed to be a powerful voice for Western interests within Confederation, not outside it. And they were successful, you know. They attracted many people who might have previously flirted with separation, but now saw a path to influence federally.
But the way reform evolved,
Yeah.
merging into the Canadian Alliance, then the modern Conservative Party, did that leave a gap?
Well, arguably, yes. By creating a strong Western base within a national mainstream conservative party, it might have also left a space for those still fundamentally committed to the idea of separation, who didn't feel represented even by reform or its successors.
Which kind of brings us closer to the present day and the resurgence we've seen more recently. Starting, the sources suggest, in the late 2010s, early 2020s, especially after Justin Trudeau's Liberals first won in 2015.
Yeah, the polling data in your sources really tracks this rise pretty clearly. Specific triggers get mentioned, like Prime Minister Trudeau's comment back in 2017 about needing to phase out the oil sands.
That caused a huge reaction.
Huge, and his general unpopularity in Alberta became quite notable. You might remember him being loudly booed at an Oilers hockey game, that sort of thing.
And the polls reflected this growing alienation.
They did. An Ipsos poll from 2018, for example, showed a notable jump. Albertans feeling they weren't getting a fair deal hit 62%. Feeling more attached to the province than the country was 46%, less committed to Canada, 34%. And importantly, support for separation itself hit 25%.
It climbed higher.
Seems so. An Angus Reid poll in early 2019 showed 50% support for secession among Albertans, though, importantly, they did note at the time that the likelihood seemed remote.
Still, 50% is a striking number.
It is. By November 2019, after the federal election that year, Ipsos polls were indicating interest in separation in both Alberta and Saskatchewan reaching historic highs. It was 33% in Alberta, 27% in Saskatchewan.
And after that 2019 election, where the Liberals won but lost seats in the West, we saw the #Waxit hashtag trending online.
We did, and the sources are careful to point out something important here. Analysis by experts found that at least some of that online push was being driven by disinformation campaigns and bots, not purely organic.
That's a crucial detail. But real groups did form.
Oh, yes. Groups like Waxit Alberta applied for federal party status. Waxit Canada was granted eligibility in 2020, and that group eventually became the Maverick Party, which still exists.
Okay, and then fast forward to the most recent federal election, 2025. Mark Carney leading the Liberals to another term. The sources say that really reignited things.
That's definitely highlighted, especially agitation among the United Conservative Party base in Alberta. There was even some renewed discussion mentioned in the sources linking the separatist sentiment to talk of, believe it or not, U.S. annexation.
Really? Joining the U.S.?
Yeah, the idea being that some in particularly rural Alberta feel a greater cultural and economic connection south of the border than they do with Eastern Canada. It's a recurring, though perhaps fringe, theme.
Okay, let's maybe dig a bit deeper now into the modern drivers. Those specific grievances that the sources detail today.
Sure. Economically, it really still boils down to resources, energy management, taxation, federal policies. Those are consistently cited as the main motivations.
And there's a difference compared to Quebec's sovereignty movement.
A key difference, the sources point out, yeah. Modern Alberta separatism seems heavily concentrated on the right of the political spectrum, particularly among UCP voters. Quebec's movement historically drew support from both the left and right.
That Angus Reid poll you mentioned earlier really showed that divide, didn't it?
Starkly. 65% of UCP voters supporting separation versus, I think it was 97% of Alberta NDP voters wanting to stay in Canada. That's a massive political polarization on the issue.
Wow. And support seems conditional sometimes.
The sources suggest that, yeah, support for separation among Albertans often seems contingent on whether they believe the federal government will adopt more oil and gas-friendly policies. Things like pipelines, less regulation.
So what are some of those specific policy demands that keep coming up in the sources?
It's quite a list. Pushing for full access to oil and gas pipeline corridors, getting product to Tidewater, repealing Bill C-69, which industry argues makes environmental reviews for major projects too cumbersome.
The No More Pipelines bill, some call it.
That's the one. Also, lifting the BC tanker ban, which restricts oil shipments off the West Coast. Eliminating the proposed oil and gas emissions cap. Scrapping the federal clean electricity regulations.
Why the clean electricity regs?
Opponents argue they'd force a transition away from natural gas power generation much too quickly for Alberta's grid. Then there's abandoning the net zero car mandate, returning carbon tax oversight fully to the provinces, and ending what they see as federal attempts to, quote, censor energy companies' communications.
That's a very specific, very energy-focused list.
Absolutely. And tied right into that is the whole debate over economic fairness, especially equalization.
Right. The feeling that Albertans pay federal taxes, which then get redistributed to provinces like Quebec.
Who might then actively oppose the very pipeline projects Alberta wants built. That's the core frustration you hear expressed.
What are the counter-arguments presented in the sources?
Well, critics argue, first, that equalization comes from general federal tax revenues collected from individuals and businesses across the country, not specifically earmarked Alberta money.
it's federal money, not provincial money being transferred.
That's the argument. They also point out that provinces like Quebec have significant natural economic advantages, like their massive, cheap hydropower resources that aren't fully captured in the equalization formula. And crucially, that Alberta's own policy choices, like having relatively low provincial taxes, impact how its fiscal capacity is measured for the formula.
So Alberta could raise more revenue itself if it chose to tax more like other provinces.
That's part of the counterpoint, yes. There's also the debate about whether oil and gas is, like, single-handedly carrying Canada financially.
What do the sources say on that?
Well, while proponents emphasize the industry's huge contribution, others highlight that oil and gas makes up about 5% of Canada's total GDP. The majority of federal transfer payments actually come from other economic sectors and from provinces that generally tax their residents at higher rates.
And there's historical context, too.
Right. The point is made that other provinces contributed significantly to national projects, like the railway that helped open up the West, back when the West was less developed. Federation, the argument goes, inherently involves some economic redistribution as different provincial economies wax and wane over time.
Okay, beyond the economics, there's that persistent sense of political marginalization, being outvoted.
Yes, that feeling of being consistently outvoted by the more populous eastern provinces, mainly Ontario and Quebec, which allows federal policies seen as harmful to Alberta to be implemented against the region's wishes.
But looking purely at representation in Parliament, are Albertans actually underrepresented compared to their population?
The sources show it's debated. After the 2022 redistribution, Alberta has about 10.8% of the seats in the House of Commons. Its share of the national population is roughly 11%, so it's pretty close.
Closer than some other provinces.
Actually, slightly better representation by population than Ontario, for instance. The argument some sources make is that the real issue isn't so much Alberta being underrepresented relative to its population, but rather that smaller provinces are significantly overrepresented relative to their population, while the larger provinces, Alberta, BC, Ontario, are closer to proportional or slightly under.
So the structure of Parliament itself is part of the issue.
Possibly. The idea of having a real Senate, maybe more like the U.S. system where smaller states get equal representation, is sometimes raised as a potential mechanism Canada lacks to effectively protect distinct regional interests, especially for provinces that aren't the most populous but still have significant economic weight.
And finally, touching on those cultural and identity grievances again.
Yeah, there's that recurring theme of feeling misunderstood, maybe even looked down upon by other Canadians, sometimes related to the province's reliance on resource industries. You know, the idea of doing the dirty jobs that others benefit from but criticize.
Is the language issue still relevant?
Some sources mention the perception that a lack of French language capacity remains a barrier to accessing federal jobs and achieving influence in Ottawa. Though others counter that this isn't really unique to the prairies. It's an issue for many Anglophone Canadians outside Quebec and New Brunswick.
And underlying it all, identity.
It seems so. A strong identity tied specifically to being conservative is presented as a core factor in much of the sources, suggesting that for some, the alienation might be more about this broader cultural political identity being out of step with the perceived direction of the rest of the country, rather than just specific policies.
Which implies that even if policies changed,
the deeper disconnect might remain for some. The goalposts might shift, as one source put it.
So how have these feelings of dissatisfaction been expressed more recently, especially since the 2025 election? What actions are being taken?
Well, the sources point to protests like the Yellow Vests movement and elements within the Freedom Convoy as expressions, at least partly, of this broader dissatisfaction with federal policies, carbon tax, vaccine mandates, things like that. These movements drew some notable support from the West.
Though support varied, and there were other elements involved too.
Absolutely. The sources are clear that support levels varied widely, and these movements also included concerning elements from the far right, which is important context.
Okay, but more specifically tied to the post-2025 election landscape and provincial government actions.
Right. The sources highlight legislative actions taken by the Alberta government under Premier Danielle Smith. This builds on that earlier push for asserting provincial autonomy we saw with the Alberta Sovereignty Act,
which aimed to challenge federal laws deemed to intrude on provincial jurisdiction.
Exactly. And similar moves like Saskatchewan's Saskatchewan First Act. More recently, there have been specific changes in Alberta to make citizen-initiated referendums much easier to trigger.
Including, potentially, a separation referendum.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Premier Smith's government significantly lowered the threshold for the number of signatures needed to force a referendum vote, dropped it from around 600,000 down to about 177,000.
That's a huge difference.
It makes it much more feasible for a dedicated group to actually get a question on the ballot. And the sources mentioned the separatist group, the Alberta Prosperity Project, has already put forward a specific proposed referendum question.
What's the question?
It's, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? Pretty straightforward. And they've publicly stated their goal is to hold this referendum by the end of 2025.
So things are moving on that front. What about other autonomy pushes, like the pension plan idea?
Yeah, the ongoing debates around potentially withdrawing Alberta from the Canada Pension Plan, CPP, to set up a provincial one are also part of this broader push for greater provincial autonomy. It's all linked to that underlying alienation sentiment.
But while all these actions are happening, the sources also present some pretty significant challenges and counterpoints to the whole idea of separation.
Absolutely. A major one is just the legality of it all under Canadian law. The sources discuss Canada's Clarity Act, which was based on Supreme Court ruling.
What does the Clarity Act require?
It requires any provincial referendum question on secession to be crystal clear, no ambiguity. And even if a clear majority voted yes on a clear question, that only triggers negotiations with the federal government and all other provinces. Any outcome would have to respect things like minority rights and, critically, Indigenous rights.
And Indigenous rights are a massive factor here, aren't they?
Huge. Treaty nations across the West have been very clear. They state that any move towards Western separatism would directly affect them and their inherent rights. Their relationship is with the Crown of Canada through treaties.
So they wouldn't necessarily just go along with separation.
Their leaders have expressed significant concern. They've demanded the withdrawal of provincial autonomy acts like the Alberta Sovereignty Act and the Saskatchewan First Act, seeing them as infringing on treaty rights and their relationship with the federal government. It's a major legal and moral hurdle.
What about public opinion? What did the most recent polls actually say about overall support for separation versus staying in Canada?
This is key. While interest has definitely risen and certain groups show high support, the sources presenting polls from May 2025 consistently show that a clear majority of Albertans still want to remain part of Canada.
So despite the noise, staying is still preferred.
According to those polls, yes. While support for leaving ranged, depending on the poll, from maybe 18% up to a high of 49% in one specific poll, support for remaining was consistently higher, typically between 51% and 70%, so still a majority favoring Canada.
Okay. And there's the practical argument, too, about things like market access.
Right. The argument that separation might actually make getting pipelines built or accessing international markets harder, not easier. Alberta would become a landlocked foreign country, needing international agreements for everything it currently takes for granted within Canada.
Have other provinces considered this before?
It's interesting. The sources bring up some historical context. Apparently, before the Quebec referendums in 1980 and 1995, there were some secret discussions within governments in provinces like Saskatchewan, looking at options if Quebec left, including annexation by the U.S.
Seriously?
Yeah. But the conclusion, according to these historical sources, was ultimately that secession just wouldn't make economic or social sense for them.
And the federal government hasn't been completely unresponsive over the years.
No, there have been attempts, even if they haven't fully resolved the alienation. Pierre Trudeau, for instance, appointed several Western senators to his cabinet back in 1980, trying to ensure Western voices were heard at the top table.
And more recently?
Well, amidst all the criticism about the difficulty of getting pipelines built, Justin Trudeau's government took the controversial step of purchasing the Trans Mountain Pipeline in 2018, arguing it was necessary to ensure its expansion got done. Whether that helped or hurt is obviously debated. And finally, there's that idea we touched on. Maybe the issue isn't just policy.
Right, that underlying identity issue.
Yeah.
Tied strongly to conservatism.
Yeah. The argument some sources make is that because the core frustration might be linked more deeply to this identity, this sense of being culturally and politically out of step with the rest of Canada, well, even if specific policy demands were met, the goalposts for dissatisfaction might just shift. The fundamental sense of alienation might persist.
So, okay, looking at everything we've unpacked from these sources, it's clear Alberta separatism is far from a simple yes-no issue.
Not at all. It's really rooted in a very long history of grievances, primarily economic, primarily political, but amplified by this distinct sense of identity. And recent federal policies, specific events, election results, they've clearly fueled the current wave of agitation and action.
It's not monolithic either.
Definitely not. It encompasses various perspectives, different motivations, different levels of commitment, from pushing for more autonomy within Canada to demanding full independence.
And while support for the idea of separation has certainly seen a resurgence, and, concrete steps are being taken towards potentially holding a referendum, the sources consistently show that the majority of Albertans, at least based on recent polls, still prefer to remain part of Canada.
Yeah, that's a crucial takeaway from the polling data presented. Understanding this whole complex history, the specific drivers we discussed, the challenges, the counterpoints highlighted in the sources, it provides really crucial context, doesn't it, for understanding the regional tensions and the political dynamics you see playing out across Canada today.
It really helps illuminate what's behind those headlines and debates you see all the time.
Makes it much clearer.
It definitely paints a much fuller picture. So here's maybe a thought for you, the listener, to consider based on all the material we've just deep dived into. Given how deep-seated some of these grievances clearly are, especially those contrasting views on economic contributions, political representation, and maybe most fundamentally, identity, what would actually need to change within Canadian federalism, if anything, to truly address this sense of Western alienation that's so clearly highlighted in these sources? That's an important question to maybe mull over.